This started as a normal TV interview, but within seconds, it turned into an uncomfortable on-air moment. What happens when a routine conversation on live television takes an unexpected turn, and a guest known mostly for comedy suddenly shifts into a serious, thoughtful tone that catches everyone off guard. Make sure to subscribe to Prime Voice, and like and comment for more real talk show coverage. The segment began in a way that felt completely normal for a daytime talk show. Will Ferrell was invited onto the panel to promote his latest project, a comedy series that had just premiered and was doing well in early streaming numbers. The hosts welcomed him warmly, and the energy in the studio was relaxed and upbeat. Will, as expected, was in good spirits, joking with the panel, laughing at small comments, and keeping the mood light in the way audiences have come to expect from him over the years. The first few minutes were exactly what viewers at home would anticipate. There was discussion about his career, how long he had been in the industry, and how he balances comedy with more serious acting roles. Whoopi made a comment about how people often forget how disciplined comedy actors have to be, and Will agreed, adding that timing and listening are more important than people realize. The audience responded with polite laughter and applause, and everything felt smooth and familiar. As the conversation continued, Sunny Hostin gradually shifted the topic toward social issues and media responsibility, which is something she often does during interviews with public figures. She referenced a recent interview Will had given where he spoke about using humor to address cultural and political topics. Sunny framed her question carefully, asking whether comedians should be more cautious about the impact of their jokes in today's climate, especially when those jokes touch on sensitive issues. At first, Will responded in a neutral and calm way. He said that he believes comedy has always reflected society and that humor can be a way for people to process difficult topics. His tone was still light, and he even added a small joke about how half the time he's just trying to make himself laugh first. The panel smiled, and the exchange still felt friendly. Sunny, however, followed up with a more pointed question. She said that while humor can be powerful, there are moments when jokes might reinforce harmful stereotypes or minimize real struggles people are facing. She asked whether Will ever feels responsible for how his comedy might be interpreted by different audiences, especially younger viewers. This is where the tone of the segment subtly changed. Will paused for a moment before answering, which was noticeable because he rarely hesitates in interviews. The audience went quiet, not in an uncomfortable way, but in the way people do when they sense a conversation is becoming more serious. Will leaned slightly forward in his chair and spoke more slowly than before. He said that he does think about responsibility, more now than he did earlier in his career. He explained that when he started, the goal was simply to be funny and to push boundaries without thinking too deeply about long-term impact. But over time, he's become more aware that his work reaches millions of people and that comedy doesn't exist in a vacuum. Sunny nodded and said she appreciated that answer, but then she pushed further. She asked whether he believes there should be limits to what comedians joke about, especially when it comes to politics, race, or social movements. She mentioned that some viewers feel certain comedians hide behind the idea of just joking to avoid accountability. This was the moment where Will's demeanor noticeably shifted. His smile faded slightly, not in a defensive way, but in a thoughtful one. He took another brief pause, and then responded in a more serious tone than at any point earlier in the segment. He said that while he understands the concern, he doesn't believe comedy should be tightly restricted by fear of backlash. He explained that comedy, when done honestly, often involves exploring uncomfortable truths, and that if comedians become too afraid to speak, the art form loses part of its purpose. He added that the key difference is intention, whether someone is trying to punch down or actually start a conversation. Sunny listened closely, and then responded that intention doesn't always equal impact. She said that even well-meaning jokes can hurt people, and that public figures have a platform that comes with real influence. Her tone remained calm and respectful, but the exchange was clearly becoming more of a debate than a casual interview. At this point, the other hosts started to shift in their seats. Joy glanced between Will and Sunny, and Whoopi leaned back slightly, observing the conversation without interrupting. The audience was quiet, focused, and fully engaged. You could feel that the segment had moved into a more serious space than originally planned. Will responded again, this time speaking even more carefully. He said that he agrees impact matters, and that he's not dismissing people's feelings. But he also said that if comedians constantly self-censor out of fear, comedy becomes less honest and less useful. He mentioned that sometimes discomfort is part of growth, both for performers and audiences. Sunny replied that growth can happen without causing harm, and that there's a difference between challenging people and making light of their experiences. Her body language remained composed, but her voice was firmer now, indicating that she felt strongly about the point she was making. The tension in the room wasn't explosive, but it was noticeable. This wasn't an argument in the traditional sense. There were no raised voices or interruptions. But it was a genuine disagreement happening in real time, in front of a live audience. The pacing of the conversation slowed, and both speakers were choosing their words more carefully. Will then said something that really shifted the tone of the segment. He admitted that he has looked back at some of his older work and felt uncomfortable with parts of it. He said that society has changed, and he has changed with it, and that he's learning like everyone else. But he emphasized that learning doesn't mean completely avoiding tough subjects. It means approaching them with more awareness. Sunny acknowledged that point and said she respected his honesty. However, she maintained that comedians should actively listen to criticism rather than dismiss it as people being overly sensitive. She said that dialogue is important and that public figures should be open to evolving their approach. The exchange ended with Will saying that he actually agrees more with Sunny than people might think, but that he also wants to protect the freedom of creative expression. He said that comedy should be a space for conversation, not a shield from responsibility or a tool for harm. As the segment moved toward a commercial break, Whoopi stepped in and thanked both of them for keeping the conversation respectful and thoughtful. The audience applauded, not in a loud celebratory way, but in a steady, appreciative manner. It was clear that viewers had just watched a rare moment where a light entertainment interview had turned into a genuine, meaningful discussion. The camera pulled back, and Will smiled again, but it was a different kind of smile, quieter, more reflective. Sunny also smiled, and the tension in the room eased slightly as the show prepared to transition. What made this moment stand out wasn't any dramatic confrontation, but the way a normally humorous guest chose to engage seriously with a sensitive topic, and how a daytime talk show created space for a real disagreement without turning it into a spectacle. It felt like one of those segments where nothing went wrong, but something real happened, and both sides left the conversation with a better understanding of each other's perspective. As the show returned from the commercial break, the atmosphere in the studio felt noticeably different from how it had been at the start of the interview. The energy was still calm, but there was a sense that both the hosts and Will were now more focused, more present in the conversation. The audience settled back into their seats, and the panel reintroduced Will briefly before continuing, as is standard for live daytime television. Whoopi picked up the discussion by summarizing what had just been said, framing it as a broader conversation about creativity, responsibility, and how public figures navigate changing social expectations. Her tone was neutral and steady, clearly trying to keep the conversation balanced and accessible for viewers at home. Sunny then followed up, saying she wanted to clarify that her intention wasn't to single out Will personally, but to use his experience as an example of how comedians today are under more scrutiny than ever before. She mentioned social media, streaming platforms, and the speed at which clips spread online, noting that even a single joke can reach millions of people in minutes. Will nodded as she spoke, listening without interrupting. His body language remained open, hands resting loosely on the table, posture relaxed but attentive. When Sunny finished, he responded by agreeing that the media landscape has changed dramatically and that performers are now living in a world where every moment is documented and dissected. He said that earlier in his career, most comedy lived in a more contained space: television, movies, stand-up specials. And once something aired, it moved on. Now, he said, everything lives forever online, and people revisit old material with new perspectives and new expectations. Joy then joined in, adding that audiences themselves have evolved, and that what people find acceptable or funny today is very different from even 10 or 15 years ago. She said that this doesn't necessarily mean comedy is dying, but that it's becoming more complex and more layered. Will agreed and said that he actually finds this shift interesting rather than frustrating. He explained that being challenged forces him to think more deeply about what he's trying to say, not just what will get a laugh. He said that while he still loves absurd humor and physical comedy, he's become more interested in humor that reflects real experiences and real conversations. Sunny responded by saying that this kind of reflection is exactly what many viewers want to see from public figures. She said that people aren't necessarily asking comedians to stop being funny, but to be more mindful of who is being included in the joke and who might feel excluded or targeted. There was a slight pause after she said this, and the audience remained quiet, listening closely. Will then said that one of the hardest parts of being in comedy is that humor is subjective. What feels harmless to one person can feel hurtful to another, and there's no universal rule that applies to every situation. He said that his approach now is to listen more than he used to, especially when people express discomfort or criticism. He admitted that in the past, his instinct might have been to brush off feedback or assume people were overreacting, but he's learned that those reactions often come from real experiences. Sunny acknowledged that point and said that listening is a powerful tool, especially when it comes from someone with influence. She added that many people feel unheard in mainstream media, and when a well-known figure shows willingness to listen, it sends a message that their voices matter. At this point, the conversation felt less like a debate and more like a mutual exchange of perspectives. The tension from earlier had softened into something more reflective. Both speakers were clearly trying to understand each other rather than prove a point. Whoopi then shifted the focus slightly by asking how these ideas have influenced his recent projects. She asked whether he consciously avoids certain topics now, or whether he simply approaches them differently. Will explained that he doesn't avoid topics outright, but he does think more about context and tone. He said that he asks himself questions he didn't always ask before, like who is the joke serving, and what is the underlying message. He added that this doesn't mean every joke has to carry a moral lesson, but that being aware of impact is part of being a responsible storyteller. Sunny reacted positively to that answer, saying that awareness is often the missing piece in these discussions. She said that many conflicts around comedy happen not because people want to control art, but because they want to feel respected and represented. Joy added that the best comedy often comes from shared experiences, not from pointing at others. She said that humor works best when people see themselves in it, rather than feeling singled out. Will smiled at that and said that some of his favorite comedians are the ones who turn the spotlight on themselves first. He said that self-deprecating humor feels safer and more honest, and it allows audiences to laugh without feeling uncomfortable. The audience laughed lightly at this, and the mood lifted slightly. You could feel the conversation moving into a more relaxed space again, even though the topic remained serious. Sunny then brought up an example of a recent comedy controversy that had gone viral online, involving a different public figure. She didn't mention names, but she described how a joke had sparked backlash and divided opinion across social media. She asked Will how he personally reacts when he sees those situations unfold. Will said that his first reaction is usually empathy, both for the person who told the joke and for the people who felt offended. He said that online outrage often flattens complex situations into simple narratives, when in reality, there are multiple perspectives involved. He added that he thinks public apologies and accountability are important, but they should come from genuine understanding rather than pressure. He said that forced apologies rarely change anything, but honest conversations can. Sunny responded by saying that accountability doesn't have to mean punishment, but it does mean acknowledging harm. She said that growth happens when people are willing to admit mistakes and learn from them. Will agreed and said that he's made plenty of mistakes in his career, both publicly and privately. He said that the difference now is that mistakes are more visible, and that visibility can either lead to learning or to defensiveness. The audience remained engaged, with occasional nods and soft murmurs of agreement. It was clear that this was one of those segments where viewers weren't just passively watching, but actively thinking along with the conversation. Whoopi then gently steered the discussion toward how media, including talk shows like this one, play a role in shaping public conversations. She said that platforms have a responsibility to host respectful dialogue, even when people disagree. Sunny said that she believes this kind of exchange is exactly what daytime television should offer. Not just entertainment, but space for thoughtful discussion that reflects real issues people are dealing with. Will said that he appreciated being part of a conversation that didn't feel hostile or performative. He said that it's rare to have time on live television to actually unpack ideas instead of just delivering sound bites. As the segment continued, the earlier tension had fully transformed into something more collaborative. There was still disagreement, but it was now framed as a shared exploration rather than a conflict. The pacing of the show remained steady, with each person speaking thoughtfully and without interruption. The camera occasionally cut to audience members, who appeared attentive and calm, not reacting with dramatic expressions, but simply listening. What stood out most about this part of the segment was how normal it felt. There was no shouting, no viral moment engineered for headlines. Instead, it was a slow, realistic conversation between people with different perspectives, trying to understand a complicated topic in real time. And for a daytime talk show, that kind of moment is often more impactful than any dramatic confrontation because it reflects how real conversations actually happen, with pauses, reflections, and a willingness to sit with uncomfortable ideas rather than rushing to a conclusion. As the conversation moved deeper into the segment, it became clear that the producers had allowed more time than usual for this discussion, likely recognizing that the exchange had evolved into something more substantial than a standard celebrity interview. The pacing remained calm, but there was a noticeable shift in how carefully everyone was choosing their words. Sunny leaned slightly forward and said that one of the reasons she raises these questions so often is because she sees the real-world impact of media narratives through her background in law and journalism. She explained that public discourse shapes how people think about each other, and that even subtle messages in entertainment can influence attitudes over time. Will listened closely, nodding as she spoke. When she finished, he responded by saying that he respects that perspective and that he doesn't take it lightly. He said that sometimes people assume comedians are detached from real life, but in reality, many of them are deeply affected by what's happening in society. He added that comedy often starts as a reaction to the world, not an escape from it. He said that some of his most successful work came from moments when he was trying to make sense of confusing or frustrating situations, and humor was the only way he knew how to process those feelings. Sunny acknowledged that point and said that humor can be a healthy coping mechanism, but she emphasized that it becomes complicated when the humor involves groups of people who already feel marginalized or misunderstood. She said that the power dynamic matters, and that jokes coming from someone with a large platform carry different weight. This led to one of the more reflective moments of the segment. Will paused again, longer this time, before answering. The studio was quiet enough that you could hear the soft background noise of the set, the kind of subtle hum that usually goes unnoticed. He said that he doesn't disagree with the idea of power dynamics, and that he's become more aware of his own position over the years. He said that success brings visibility, and visibility brings responsibility, whether someone wants it or not. However, he also said that he struggles with the idea that comedy should be filtered through constant fear of misinterpretation. He explained that part of what makes humor effective is its spontaneity and honesty, and that over-policing creative expression can lead to a kind of emotional distance between performers and audiences. Sunny responded by saying that accountability doesn't have to mean fear, and that many people confuse the two. She said that being mindful doesn't require walking on eggshells, but it does require empathy and awareness of perspectives beyond one's own. Joy chimed in again, saying that this tension between freedom and responsibility isn't new, but it feels more intense now because of how connected and polarized society has become. She said that people are quicker to react and slower to listen, which makes thoughtful conversations even more important. Will agreed and said that social media has changed the emotional rhythm of public dialogue. He said that reactions are often immediate and extreme, while reflection takes time. He added that comedians, like everyone else, are navigating this new environment without a clear guidebook. Sunny said that one of her concerns is that many public figures respond to criticism by dismissing it entirely, rather than engaging with it. She said that this creates a cycle where people feel unheard, which leads to more frustration and more conflict. Will responded by saying that defensiveness is a natural human reaction, especially when someone feels misunderstood. He said that learning to sit with criticism without taking it personally is something he's still working on. He admitted that earlier in his career, he might have laughed off serious feedback or assumed it came from people who simply didn't get his humor. But now, he said, he tries to separate his identity from his work and listen more objectively. This moment felt particularly genuine, and the audience responded with a small round of applause, not prompted by any joke or dramatic statement, but by the honesty of what he had just shared. Sunny smiled slightly and said that growth often starts with that kind of self-awareness. She said that no one expects perfection, but people do appreciate sincerity. Whoopi then asked how Will thinks this kind of conversation could influence younger comedians who are just starting out. She said that many aspiring performers look up to established figures for guidance, whether intentionally or not. Will said that he hopes younger comedians feel encouraged to explore their voices without fear, but also with curiosity and respect. He said that comedy should be a space where people feel free to express themselves, but also willing to evolve as they learn more about the world and the people in it. Sunny added that she hopes emerging voices see these conversations as invitations rather than warnings. She said that dialogue doesn't have to be a threat to creativity, and that some of the most powerful art comes from listening as much as speaking. The discussion then shifted toward the role of audiences themselves. Joy pointed out that viewers also play a part in shaping what becomes acceptable or popular. She said that people often focus on what performers should or shouldn't do, but forget that audience reactions drive demand. Will agreed and said that comedians respond to feedback, whether it's applause, silence, or criticism. He said that every performance is a conversation, even if only one person is speaking at a time. Sunny said that this is why representation matters so much in media. She said that when more diverse voices are included in entertainment, humor becomes richer and more inclusive, because it reflects a wider range of experiences. Will responded that he's noticed this shift in recent years, especially in writing rooms and creative teams. He said that collaboration with people from different backgrounds has made his work better, not worse, because it challenges assumptions and brings new perspectives. The tone of the segment at this point was no longer tense at all. It had transformed into something closer to a panel discussion, with each person building on the other's points rather than pushing against them. The studio audience remained attentive, with occasional nods and soft reactions, but no loud interruptions. The atmosphere felt thoughtful, almost educational, which is relatively rare for a segment that began as a comedy promotion. What made this part of the exchange stand out was how normal and unscripted it felt. There were no rehearsed lines or prepared talking points. Instead, it was a real-time conversation shaped by listening, reflection, and gradual shifts in perspective. Will was no longer speaking as a celebrity guest, but as someone genuinely engaged in a broader cultural discussion. Sunny was no longer challenging him, but collaborating with him in exploring a complicated topic. And for viewers watching at home, it likely felt less like watching a show and more like witnessing a conversation they might have with friends or colleagues. One where no one has all the answers, but everyone is trying to understand the questions better. As the segment moved closer to its final portion, the conversation naturally began to widen in scope. It was no longer just about Will Ferrell or even about comedians in general, but about how public conversations evolve in a media environment that is constantly changing. The hosts seemed aware that they had touched on something deeper than originally planned, and instead of redirecting back to light promotion, they allowed the discussion to continue in its current direction. Sunny said that one of the challenges with modern media is that nuance often gets lost. She explained that complex conversations are frequently reduced to short clips or headlines that strip away context, making it harder for audiences to understand what was actually said or intended. She mentioned that this is especially true on social platforms, where attention spans are shorter and emotional reactions are amplified. Will responded by saying that he's experienced that firsthand. He said that he's had interviews where a single sentence was taken out of a much longer conversation and presented as if it represented his entire viewpoint. He added that this can be frustrating, not because of criticism itself, but because of how easily meaning can be distorted. Joy added that this kind of distortion doesn't just affect celebrities, but everyday people as well. She said that the way communication happens now encourages quick judgments and discourages deeper listening, which makes thoughtful dialogue feel more difficult than it should be. Will agreed and said that one of the reasons he appreciated this particular conversation was because it allowed space for pauses and reflection. He said that not every topic needs an immediate conclusion, and that sometimes the most valuable part of a discussion is simply acknowledging complexity. Sunny said that this is something she tries to model on the show, even when she knows her questions might make guests uncomfortable. She explained that discomfort isn't necessarily a bad thing, and that growth often begins when people are willing to engage with ideas that challenge them. Will responded by saying that he didn't feel attacked by her questions, even when they were pointed. He said that the difference was in her tone and intention, which felt curious rather than confrontational. He added that this made it easier for him to respond honestly instead of defensively. This comment seemed to resonate with the rest of the panel. Whoopi nodded and said that intention matters a lot in conversations like this. She said that disagreement doesn't have to mean conflict, and that people can hold different views without trying to win or dominate the discussion. The audience reacted with light applause, not in a dramatic way, but in recognition of a sentiment that felt relatable. The studio atmosphere remained calm and respectful, with no sense of urgency to wrap things up or move on. Sunny then asked Will a more personal question. She asked whether these kinds of conversations have changed how he sees his role in the public eye, not just as an entertainer, but as someone whose voice carries weight. Will paused again, and this time the pause felt more introspective than before. He said that he never set out to be a role model or a cultural commentator. He described himself as someone who simply wanted to make people laugh and feel better, especially during stressful or uncertain times. However, he said that over the years, he's come to accept that visibility creates responsibility, whether someone asks for it or not. He said that he's more conscious now of how his words and actions might be interpreted, even outside of his work. Sunny responded that this awareness is something many public figures struggle with, especially those who become famous through entertainment rather than activism or journalism. She said that the transition from performer to public voice isn't always smooth or intentional. Will agreed and said that it can feel strange to be asked for opinions on serious topics when your career is built on making people laugh. He said that sometimes he feels unqualified, and other times he feels pressure to say the right thing instead of the honest thing. Joy said that this tension is part of being human, not just part of being famous. She said that everyone navigates different roles in their lives, and that identity is rarely fixed or simple. The conversation then touched briefly on how audiences project expectations onto public figures. Sunny said that people often want celebrities to reflect their own values, and when they don't, disappointment can turn into criticism or anger. Will said that he's learned not to take that personally, even though it can be difficult. He said that people form emotional connections with performers, and those connections come with expectations that aren't always realistic. Whoopi added that this is why it's important for viewers to remember that entertainers are still individuals with evolving opinions and perspectives. She said that growth should be seen as a positive thing, not as inconsistency or weakness. The segment had now fully shifted into a reflective discussion about communication, identity, and responsibility. There were no jokes, no promotional lines, and no attempt to steer the conversation back to lighter territory. Instead, the show allowed the moment to unfold naturally. Sunny said that this kind of exchange is rare on live television, not because people don't want to have these conversations, but because time constraints usually prevent them. She said that it was refreshing to see a guest willing to engage without trying to deflect or simplify the topic. Will smiled slightly and said that he felt the same way. He said that he came into the show expecting a fun, casual interview, but he appreciated how it turned into something more meaningful. He added that these are the kinds of conversations that stay with him longer than most promotional appearances. The audience responded with another round of applause, this time a little stronger than before. It wasn't enthusiastic cheering, but a steady, collective acknowledgement that something genuine had taken place. As the hosts began to glance at the time, it became clear that the segment was nearing its end. There was no dramatic wrap-up or emotional climax, just a gradual sense of closure as the conversation slowed. Sunny thanked Will for his openness and said that she hoped viewers at home felt encouraged to have similar discussions in their own lives. She said that respectful disagreement is a healthy part of any society, and that listening is just as important as speaking. Will thanked the panel for giving him space to think out loud. He said that he doesn't always get these opportunities, and that he valued the chance to reflect in a public setting without feeling pressured to perform. The camera briefly cut to the audience, showing people nodding and smiling, some whispering quietly to each other. The mood was calm, thoughtful, and unusually serious for a daytime talk show segment featuring a comedy star. What stood out most about this part of the exchange was how understated it was. There was no viral moment, no shocking line, and no visible conflict. Instead, it was defined by pauses, measured responses, and a shared willingness to explore complex ideas without rushing to conclusions. And in the context of live television, that kind of quiet, reflective moment often feels more real than any dramatic confrontation ever could. As the segment approached its final minutes, the producers subtly began to shift the pacing, signaling that the conversation would soon need to come to a close. You could sense it in the way the camera lingered a little longer on each speaker, and in how the hosts started to summarize rather than introduce new topics. The discussion had reached a natural resting point, not because everything had been resolved, but because it had unfolded as far as it reasonably could within the limits of a live daytime show. Whoopi took the lead in wrapping things up, thanking Will again for being open and willing to engage in what she described as a real conversation, not just a TV one. Her tone was warm but grounded, and it reflected what many viewers were likely feeling at home, that they had just witnessed something more thoughtful than the average celebrity appearance. Sunny then added a brief closing remark, saying that she appreciated Will's honesty and that these kinds of exchanges are important, even when they feel uncomfortable or unresolved. She emphasized that disagreement doesn't have to mean division, and that dialogue itself is a form of progress. Will responded by thanking all of the hosts for giving him the space to speak seriously. He said that he knows people expect him to be funny all the time, but that he values opportunities to talk about real issues in a sincere way. He said that comedy will always be a big part of who he is, but it's not the only part, and he doesn't want to hide behind humor when a conversation deserves more depth. There was a final moment of light laughter when Joy jokingly said that she still expected him to make her laugh before the show ended. Will smiled and replied that he'd try not to disappoint, but even that line felt gentle rather than performative. The laughter from the audience was soft and natural, easing the seriousness of the previous discussion without undermining it. As the segment officially ended, the audience applauded. It wasn't loud or explosive, but steady and sustained. It was the kind of applause that suggests appreciation rather than excitement, a recognition that something meaningful had just taken place. The show then moved on to the next topic, but the energy in the studio remained slightly different. The hosts seemed more reflective, and even their body language had shifted. There was less of the usual quick banter and more of a calm, composed tone as they transitioned into the following segment. For viewers watching at home, the moment didn't feel like something that would immediately dominate headlines or trend aggressively on social media. There was no dramatic confrontation, no viral quote, and no obvious winner in the exchange. Instead, what stood out was the quiet seriousness of the conversation and the way it unfolded without pressure or spectacle. However, after the episode aired, clips of the segment did begin circulating online, especially among viewers who appreciated the more thoughtful tone. Many comments focused on how different it felt to see Will Ferrell speaking so earnestly, without jokes or characters, and how refreshing it was to watch a daytime talk show allow a complex topic to breathe. Some viewers praised Sunny for asking difficult but respectful questions, saying that her approach encouraged a deeper discussion rather than a defensive one. Others highlighted Will's responses, noting that he didn't dismiss criticism or rely on humor to deflect, but instead engaged with the ideas directly. There were also mixed reactions, as there usually are with conversations about comedy and responsibility. Some people felt that comedians should not have to explain or justify their work, and that too much analysis can take the joy out of humor. Others felt that the segment was an example of how public figures can use their platforms to promote understanding rather than division. What was interesting was that the discussion online largely mirrored the tone of the segment itself. There wasn't a wave of outrage or polarized arguments. Instead, there were long threads of people sharing their own perspectives, experiences, and interpretations of what had been said. Several viewers commented that the segment reminded them of how conversations used to feel before everything became so reactive and compressed into short clips. They appreciated the slower pacing, the lack of interruptions, and the sense that everyone involved was genuinely listening. In follow-up interviews later that week, one of the hosts briefly mentioned the segment and said that it wasn't planned as a serious moment, but that it naturally evolved that way. She said that sometimes the most memorable parts of the show are the ones that aren't scripted or anticipated. Will himself didn't make any major public statements about the exchange, but in a separate promotional interview for his project, he was asked about it. He said that he enjoyed the conversation and that he thinks it's healthy for people in entertainment to reflect on their roles and responsibilities from time to time. He described it as a good talk, rather than anything dramatic or controversial. Sunny also referenced the moment in a later episode, saying that she believes these kinds of discussions are exactly what daytime television can offer at its best, not just entertainment, but space for real dialogue that reflects what people are thinking and feeling. Looking back, what made the segment stand out wasn't any single line or emotional moment, but the overall tone. It was a reminder that not every tense exchange has to escalate into conflict, and not every disagreement needs to end with resolution. Instead, this was a moment where two people with different perspectives met in the middle of a live television setting and chose to listen rather than perform. It was subtle, grounded, and emotionally realistic, the kind of interaction that often goes unnoticed because it doesn't fit into a dramatic narrative. But for many viewers, that subtlety was exactly what made it memorable. It felt like a real conversation happening in real time, with real pauses, real uncertainty, and real reflection. And in a media environment where so much content is built around extremes, reactions, and spectacle, that kind of quiet, thoughtful exchange can feel surprisingly rare. So while the segment didn't produce headlines or controversy, it left behind something arguably more valuable: a sense that public conversations can still be respectful, nuanced, and human, even when the topics are complicated and the people involved come from very different worlds. And that's why moments like this tend to stay with viewers longer than expected. Not because they were shocking, but because they felt honest. Share your opinion in the comments and subscribe to Prime Voice for more narration-based talk show stories.